Thank you for joining me. I'm Gord Long. A reminder before we begin, do not trade from any of these slides. They are commentary for educational and discussion purposes only. Always consult a professional financial advisor before making any investment decisions. In this month's Under the Lens video, I'd like to discuss what I see to be the most important market controlling element currently underway. It is a proven fact that it controls markets, while being the least understood and most misrepresented. It is a shift in sentiment. Critically important to today's discussion is about this shift being a larger degree secular shift and not just a cyclical shift. I know most of you will be skeptical of my views on this, but hear me out in this video. It may possibly reorient your market views and investment thinking. It is a big subject, but in the limited time we have in this video, I'd like to cover those items listed here. Few would disagree with the thinking behind the charts like this. Most of us have all been there and experienced these emotional stages. More often than not, the thinking is that as the market moves, we react to it emotionally, shifting between extreme levels of greed and fear as we reactively shift between euphoria and capitulation. I want you to shift your thinking 180 degrees on this, and for you to consider that it is actually the market which is reacting to a shift in sentiment. The dominant driver is a sentiment shift and not market movement. The cause is a sentiment shift. The effect is market price action. Former Federal Reserve Chairman Alan Greenspan opined in a congressional Humphrey Hawkins review of Fed policy that it was a shift in sentiment which was the least understood, least predictable, the most impactful on policy, and that which influenced financial markets the most. It is the old question of what came first, the chicken or the egg. Let's start with a brief discussion on long cycles. This is itself a big subject, so we can only touch on a few key points. I refer you to our Macro Analytics YouTube channel for videos on various elements of long cycles we have released over the last 10 years. History moves in cycles that are larger than any person, corporation, elite, or technology. Much has been written on this subject, and I have personally interviewed notable long cycle experts such as Martin Armstrong and Harry Dent, to name a few. These and other interviews can be found at the Financial Repression Authority website, which I co-founded. For the sake of time, I will leave you to explore the basis of their research outlined in those interviews. As you can see here by the vertical red bar, all of Harry Dent's cycles, the 45-year innovation cycle, the 39-year generational cycle, the 35-year geopolitical cycle, and the 10-year boom-bust cycle, all align presently on a downslope through approximately 2021. Martin Armstrong's cycles, with a completely different basis, shows a similar long-term lower cyclical pivot here. Most recently, Peter Turchin's cycle of social integration and disintegration, which he explained in his 2016 book, Ages of Discord, outlines that human history manifests cycles of social disintegration and integration in which the impulse to cooperate in large social structures waxes and wanes. Let's consider the four overlapping aligning cycles depicted on this chart. Turchin identified 25-year cycles that combine into roughly 50-year cycles, comparable, though not identical with, the familiar Kondratiev long-wave economic cycles. The 50-year cycles are part of a longer 150 to 200-year cycles that move from cooperation through an age of discord and disintegration to a new era of cooperation. This work draws upon his previous books, including War and Peace and War, The Rise and Fall of Empires, The Lessons of Empires, Once Privilege Limits Social Mobility, Collapse is Inevitable. These long cycles parallel the cyclical analysis of David Hackett Fisher's masterwork, The Great Wave, Price Revolutions, and The Rhythm of History. Turchin's model identifies three primary forces in these cycles: an oversupply of labor that suppresses real, inflation-adjusted wages, 2, an overproduction by parasitic elites, and 3, a deterioration in central state finances, that over-indebtedness, decline in tax revenues, increase in state dependence, fiscal burdens of war, etc. These combine to influence the social order, which is characterized in eras of discord by declining loyalty to self-serving special interests, that is, disintegration. The 4 cycles depicted are 1. The cycle of credit expansion and contraction, which is now in the final blow-off stages of unsustainable credit expansions, that is a bubble, which will inevitably lead to renunciation of debt, a credit collapse, and a global depression. Number 2, the generational cycles, 4 generations or approximately 80 years, of American history, which leads to nation-changing social, political, and economic upheaval. For example, the American Revolution, 1781 plus 80 years equals a Civil War. 1861 plus 80 years equals 1941, World War II. World War II plus 80 years is 2021, as described in the book The Fourth Turning. Number 3 is the 100-year cycle of price inflation and stagnation of wages purchasing power, which began around 1901, is now reaching the final stages of widespread turmoil, shortages, famine, conflict, and crisis. This can be viewed as aligned with the Turchin cycle of social disorder and disintegration. Number 4 is the demographic cycle. The workforce stops expanding and starts shrinking while the population of dependent elderly explodes higher, triggering a decline in earnings and the tax base, just as taxes must increase to pay for the care of the rising population of elderly. This is one dynamic in Turchin's deterioration in central state finances. Sound familiar? Well laid out in exactly a description of where we're at today. All of these cycles aligned around the global financial meltdown of 2008-2009, and elites have done nothing but kick the can down the road for over a decade in an ad hoc explosion of TINA, that is, there is no alternative. Nothing that's broken has been fixed. All that's been done is trillions in currency has been borrowed or printed to paper over the dissolution, decay, and decline. The demographic cycle has only accelerated. The expansion of credit has now reached extremes no one thought possible, much less necessary just 15 years ago. The generational cycle is playing out perfectly with Trump, Brexit, yellow vests, etc., all erupting a few years before the terminal crisis begins in 2021. Asset inflations have exploded higher since the late 1990s in one asset class after another, until now it's the everything bubble. Despite official claims of low inflation, the cost of healthcare, childcare, higher education, rent, and other essentials has skyrocketed in the past decade, and the cost of tradable goods is now beginning to accelerate as globalization and financialization unravel long supply chains and zombie corporations. Resource depletion and geopolitical conflict could create sacrifices that the status quo has long dismissed as impossible, scarcities that could push prices for necessities through the roof. The future won't be as placid, secure, and predictable as the status quo would have you currently believe. A COVID-19 vaccine, or lack thereof, will have zero effect in terms of reversing these cycles. Call it fate, call it karma, call it what you will, but the cycles have aligned, and nothing can stop the unraveling of all that was foolishly presumed to be permanent. You are likely familiar with the Elliott wave principle, which helps identify wave patterns in terms of price, time, and pattern. It is completely premised on changing sentiment and the market patterns that shift in sentiment exhibits. It is well followed by market practitioners, and whether you subscribe to it or not, you need to recognize minimally the predictable correlation between market and the sentiment patterns. Two of the best proven predictors out there using the Elliott wave principle, in my mind, are Dr. Robert McHugh and the well-followed Avi Gilbert. Dr. McHugh's research shows markets around the world have all reached or are very close to nearing completion of a multi-decade grand supercycle 3 wave. He is warning of a massive coming stock market decline, bear market, and economic depression. Here's what he recently wrote at the end of 2019, and I quote him: confirming the dangerous warning from the multi-decade jaws of death pattern is a simultaneous multi-decade massive rising bearish wedge pattern. This pattern is finishing here in 2019. The industrials are finishing this pattern here of a rising bearish pattern is a cycle degree wave 5 up, which will complete super cycle degree 5 up and grand super cycle degree wave 3 up. Both the megaphone jaws of death and the simultaneous rising bearish wedge pattern have the same downside price target of 4,000 with lower potential. As for this rising bearish wedge, it means that the rally from December 24, 2018 is part of the final subwave E up to complete this ominous bear wedge. If so, a market collapse will follow. End of quote. 60 days later, the COVID-19 pandemic triggered a historic market sell-off. Not for one moment did he predict the pandemic, but rather that sentiment had shifted and was ripe to react to anything potentially fearful after more or less ignoring bad news for most of the last decade. Avi Gilbert writes that we have a little more to go before nearing a major historic retracement cusp, which will last for most of this decade and possibly part of the next. Both of these practitioners are not known to be prone to be doom and gloomers, but simply followers of the established rules of the Elliott wave principle and its proven identification and shifts in sentiment. Whether you agree with long cycles or the Elliott wave principles, let's at least agree that it is remarkable that so many different experts using different sentiment or attitude methodologies are arriving at the same point in time. Their historical research suggests that we are entering a period of a secular shift in sentiment towards a period of negative bias in attitude, sentiment, confidence, trust. Let's now examine well-established shorter-term sentiment measures. Let's start with the University of Michigan Consumer Sentiment Index, where I have labeled what appears to be a head and shoulders pattern. As you may remember, I was flagging this potential head and shoulders pattern since the fall of 2018. Notice how the GDP growth in the lower panel has been steadily falling in line with this potential secular shift in sentiment. I have posted many studies on the correlation of the Consumer Comfort Index with market actions, which can be found by searching Consumer Comfort on the MetaSii.com website. Most of the charts originate from Dr. Ed Yardeni. He has recently stopped posting the correlation because after many years it appears to have completely broken down. Maybe it hasn't, and the markets are reflecting how liquidity into 5 stocks is currently fundamentally distorting the correlation. What we need to recognize now, however, is that we are seeing a historical collapse in the Bloomberg Consumer Comfort Index. The 4 most commonly tracked measures of sentiment are, first, the Conference Board's Consumer Confidence Index shown here. It shows consumer confidence to be at levels much lower than those even during the 2008 financial crisis. Secondly, the AAII Investor Sentiment Index is well below the historical average of 30.5% at a reading of 45%. Contrarian traders love this index and always trade against it. The bigger the negative sentiment, the more they trade long. Remember, these are short-term traders, not long-term positioning investors. The smart money taking longer-term positions normally aligns with increasing bearish investor sentiment. Third is the Consumer Comfort Index I just referenced earlier. It is at levels last seen during the European financial crisis when worries of Greece default struck terror in global markets. It is not so much the level here as the magnitude of the shock to consumer comfort that may be most important. Fourth is the Small Business Optimism Index. We see again the identifiable shock pattern. Consumer consumption is approximately 65% of the U.S. economy, while the U.S. economy is dependent on small business for nearly 70% of its economic activity. Shifting sentiment has a profound impact on the world's largest economy, and most economies around the world experiencing similar shocks. When I witness active fund managers increasing their cash levels in a down market, it is a sure sign they believe a serious economic and market downturn is ahead. Their sentiment has shifted. The Oracle of Omaha, Warren Buffett, was already sitting on $137 billion in cash before recently selling all of his holdings in 4 major U.S. airlines while cutting his holdings in Goldman Sachs and J.P. Morgan Chase. This is a man who buys and holds and doesn't exit a position unless something fatally fundamental alters his investment thesis. This is also the man who says, be fearful when others are greedy and greedy when they are fearful. Buffett would now appear to be noticeably on the fearful side. A sentiment indicator that I consider to be extremely important in the identification of secular shifts in sentiment is the measure of public trust. It has been steadily eroding since the U.S. adopted a fiat currency and principles of sound money. Here again we have a case of what came first. The erosion of public trust has accelerated since the dot-com bubble, imploding with increasingly evident broken truths, political polarization, blatant government corruption, and a biased media selling narratives versus product. In the largest context, sentiment is becoming increasingly negative, fearful, cynical, and protective. We have the advent of a crisis of trust. When the foundations of trust and the firm beliefs in the rule of law are cracked, along with weakening confidence and sentiment, the resulting uncertainty and cynicism leads to weakening investment. Falling risk investment leads to shrinking economic and job growth. This leads to economic stagnation. All of this fits perfectly within the roadmap for a fiat currency collapse as a result of the adoption of unsound money practices. No economy has ever avoided the final outcome of this roadmap. Ludwig von Mises said it as well as anyone. There is no means of avoiding the final collapse of a boom brought about by credit expansion. The alternative is only whether the crisis should come sooner as the result of voluntary abandonment of further credit expansion, or later as a final and total catastrophe of the currency system involved. The manager of the world's largest hedge fund has written extensively on cycles and why we are in the midst of a profound shift. He details the typical big cycles behind empires' rise and declines, which he sees the world to be in the process of undertaking. What we are experiencing, in my mind, is something similar to what we as a society experienced in the 1920s and the 1930s. I touched on this in my latest long-wave video entitled The Greater Depression. Due to a major secular shift in sentiment, we are at the beginnings of a sustained period of global economic turmoil, likely to last for years, but to be the most profound over the next 3 years. I refer you also to this year's 2020 thesis paper on global conflict and the reasons for global conflict. The financial markets are prone to experiencing an initial collapse in PE multiples before markets explode higher as a result of unprecedented monetary and fiscal policies. Policies that will involve, likely, market guarantees, central bank buying of ever-expanding security products, conservatorships for pensions, and even the possibility of expanding of the nationalization of financial markets. Expect another shock, whether a wave 2 of the coronavirus or something else. It will provoke further fear. Don't get caught in what may be a historical bear trap. Why take the risk? As I always remind you in these videos, remember, politicians and central banks will print the money to solve any and all problems until such time as no one will take the money or it is of no value. That day is still in the future, so take advantage of the opportunities as they currently exist. Investing is always easier when you know with relative certainty how the powers to be will react. Your chances of success go up dramatically. The powers to be are now effectively trapped by policies of fiat currencies, unsound money, political polarization, and global policy paralysis. I would like to take a moment as a reminder, do not trade from any of these slides. They are for educational and discussion purposes only. As negative as these comments often are, there has seldom been a better time for investing. However, it requires careful analysis and not following what has traditionally been the true and tried approaches. Do your reading and make sure you have a knowledgeable and well-informed financial advisor. So until we talk again, may 2020 turn out to be an outstanding investment year for you and your family. Thank you for listening.